Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is author and historian Matt Lewis. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Daz. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Matt authored a book called History Hits Medieval Guide to England. Sorry, I couldn't get my words out there. So in today's episode, we're going to discuss some of the medieval period's important events. And of course, it's a long period, so, you know, there's quite a lot to cover. But before we get into that, Matt, would you like to explain when the medieval period actually starts?
Yeah, so in general terms, you're talking about roughly 1,000 years from the end of the Roman Empire in England, so around about 410. They leave Britain up to the arrival of the Tudors, so that puts us at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. None of those are kind of really hard lines, so I would probably say, when I say medieval, I mean 450 to 1500, and we split that up into early medieval, which would be kind of around 450 to 1066, Battle of Hastings. We then have kind of high medieval, which gives us the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, and then we go into late medieval for sort of 14th, 15th centuries.
Yeah, and again, this is that period, and again, it's such a long period, but this is where you see the birth of England and, you know, all sorts of things going. Like you said, that early period is really important. Not a lot is, I mean, yeah, there is lots known about it, but there's, because they didn't keep the records in the early part, did they? And also, you get this misperception that the Romans the Romans just sort of left England and that was it, you know, and nothing happened. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so I mean, you quite often get that period of the early medieval being described as the Dark Ages, and people have taken that to mean it was an age in which there was no learning, there was no art, but none of that is true. You know, the early medieval period has produced some absolutely astonishing pieces of artwork. Just in Anglo-Saxon England, you think about the Sutton Hoo burial and some of the jewellery and all of that kind of thing, the talks that have been found from the Anglo-Saxon period and this post-Roman world. And there is very clearly a lot going on. It generally got called the Dark Ages in the first place because we don't have the source material to shed a lot of light on it. And that's just because these things haven't survived. And there is a period in British history after the evacuation of Rome and before the establishment of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms where things just weren't very well recorded. So there is a lot going on that is incredibly interesting. We struggle to know as much about it as we would like to, but we can get at bits. So when you bring together the archaeology and the written sources that we do have and what we know about the people of the period, you can start to get a really interesting picture of a colourful and incredibly important formative time in English history. This is when England, in terms of the country that we would recognise as England in the medieval period, is being born, it's being forged, it's being crafted out of all of these fractured, small places run by warlords that eventually become bigger and bigger kingdoms until, in the reign of Athelstan, they become one nation known as England.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you get to a very significant date and year, and you'll know what this is. I won't need to tell you, but that is when England really sort of changes its direction. And yeah, so 1066, we have the Norman invasion, don't we? So how big a moment is this in English history?
There is a temptation, I think, for historians and people who talk about history to talk about defining moments that really change everything. But I do think you can put the Battle of Hastings in 1066 as one of those real turning point moments in history. This is absolutely pivotal. It does change the fabric, the structure and the face of English society. So we go from being this Anglo-Saxon kingdom with a set of particular laws that have evolved in the Anglo-Saxon world, a particular way of doing things, an elective kingship, something people don't talk about too much in the Anglo-Saxon world, but effectively there was a council, the Witan, that elected the next monarch. And all of that is effectively swept away in 1066 when the Normans arrive. And what William the Conqueror brings is a much closer connection to the continent because he's Duke of Normandy. So all of a sudden, England is fused to Normandy on the continent. And he brings the only way of ruling that he understands, which is a much more French way of doing things. He brings over as well a Norman elite who will replace in overwhelmingly most of the places in England will replace the old Anglo-Saxon nobility. So you have an entire elite, an entire way of doing things, an entire form of government utterly swept away, pushed out into the sea almost in one day at the Battle of Hastings, and replaced by this incoming, conquering new elite from Normandy. And perhaps the greatest symbol of that happening is the castle. You've got a picture of the White Tower at the Tower of London up there. Yeah. Normans bring castles because they're on the continent. There are one or two Motte and Bailey things that exist in England. There have been hill forts that have been used since the Iron Age. But the stone castle as a way for a minority elite to control the majority population and to stamp themselves onto the countryside comes with the Norman invasion. And you think about how we think of the medieval world today, and castles are central to that. We think about the stunning ruins all over England and the British Isles. They wouldn't be here probably if the Normans hadn't come, or at least they would have arrived an awful lot later.
Mm-hmm. And I was actually in London the other day, and I was thinking to myself, and it's dwarfed now by all the tower blocks that are there and stuff like that. But at the time, of course, this was, they put there, wasn't it, to tell everyone, we're here, we're not going anywhere, and we control this country. And I can imagine you could probably see the White Tower from quite far away.
Absolutely. I mean, traditionally, it was sort of an unwritten rule almost that the top of the church spire was meant to be the highest spot in any town or city. And obviously that's not the case anymore because we have high-rise blocks and much bigger buildings than there were then. So the only other thing that would have come close to the White Tower would have been any churches that were dotted around that were quite tall. And then all of a sudden, in a city full of one and maybe two-storey buildings and the odd church spire, all of a sudden you have this huge, monstrous edifice planted on the side of the River Thames, made with canned stone. It's not even looking like anything around it because it's made with this white stone that William the Conqueror brings over from Cannes, which is why it's called the White Tower. It looks completely different. It looks like nothing that has ever been there. It doesn't even look like it's made with local stone because it isn't. It is absolutely foreign and a perfect representation of the new foreign ruling elite that have taken over England.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and also I think there's a misconception that the Normans obviously they in 1066 when they invade and they take over the country and William is crowned, that it's just straight away Norman life, but it's not, is it? It takes a long time for the Normans to get themselves settled in England and change things, though, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it takes William the Conqueror a long time just to get into London. So the Battle of Hastings takes place in October. He's crowned in London on Christmas Day on the 25th of December in 1066, and it takes him that 2-month period to sort of negotiate his way into London because he's won the Battle of Hastings, and I've said that everything changes on that day, and to some extent it does because what follows becomes almost inevitable. Excuse me. But we do see the Anglo-Saxon Witan, that council, they elect and choose a new different king, a guy called Edgar. But obviously William the Conqueror isn't going to think, well, I've won the Battle of Hastings, killed King Harold, oh well, they've appointed Edgar, I better go home. So he tries to force himself onto London, and it takes him a while to get himself in there and become accepted, and eventually the Witan will set Edgar aside. He's just a 15-year-old boy who, Edgar has an incredible career of opposing William on several occasions and managing to get away with it, and he'll go on crusade to Jerusalem and we don't know what happens to him in the end. We don't know when he actually dies, but a fascinating character in his own right. And then it does take a long time. So then you have this push outwards, and you get the castles beginning to arrive. So initially, wooden Motte and Bailey castles springing up all over the place. And quite quickly, some of those are replaced with stone buildings. So, for example, my favourite castle in the world is Ludlow Castle. And that's being built in stone by the 1080s. So within 20 years of the conquest, that is being erected in stone because it's on that really troublesome frontier of the Welsh border. The Normans never managed to conquer Wales as effectively as they do in England. And so you get this whole line of castles up the Welsh border, the Welsh marches. It's really heavily populated with castles because that's where they get to, that's where their frontier is, and they start throwing up these stone castles to protect the borders of what they've managed to take. And you get some incredible instances of resistance to the Normans too, and perhaps the most famous and the most interesting is a guy we know as Hereward the Wake. The Wake is kind of a name that was given to him much later that attaches him to a family, the Wake family, who wanted to associate themselves with Hereward. He wasn't necessarily actually an ancestor of theirs. But I'm going to show my age here by comparing his story to an episode of the A-Team, because this is a guy who, gets into tough corners all of the time against William and finds an inventive way to come out of it. If he could be in a garage with a welding machine and the A-Team music playing and then burst out with this armour-plated Jeep that manages to get past everybody, that is Hereward. He is having these incredible adventures opposing William. He gets captured and escapes, and he sneaks into the royal court and manages to get away, constantly embarrasses William, thwarts all of his attempts to attack the Isle of Ely where they're based. And it's just an absolutely fantastic story. And it ends up with William recognising Hereward's prowess and ability, and he gives him back his father's lands, which Hereward had lost to the Normans. And that's essentially what he's fighting for. And then Hereward is able to see out the rest of his days in peace. But you do have this fairly long period of resistance and difficulty for the Normans. And that's why you see so many castles springing up, because they have to crush all of that resistance.
Wow. Yeah, that's it. Really interesting. That's a podcast on its own in the future.
It is. Hereward deserves a Hollywood film. I'm telling you,
Oh.
it is the story that no one talks about. That is absolutely.
It's the first time
incredible.
I've heard of it, to be honest. I must admit. And again, the Norman history itself, and that I've never really delved that deep into it. So I know also they had a lot of hardship up in the north, didn't they? He was quite brutal up in the north of England.
Yeah. So there's this resistance breaks out predominantly in the north. The north is traditionally a long way from London. It's still a fairly long way from London, so it's beyond the reach of royal control quite often, and so it's a perfect place to foment rebellion. And you get lots of trouble from the earls up there, the old Anglo-Saxon lords who want to resist. And this is kind of around about the time of Hereward the Wake and all of this resistance, and the harrying of the north, as it's remembered, is the moment, I think, when William kind of snaps and just loses his cool, and he steams up there with an army and he kills anyone he can find and he burns farmland. And they talk about for decades afterward, these communities don't recover. Whole villages are abandoned. Farmland is left utterly unusable. People up there starve for years to follow because they can't grow crops on the land that William has destroyed. And it gets remembered as the harrying of the north, and it's a moment in which even the Norman chroniclers, so there's a monk called Orderic Vitalis who is an Anglo-Norman monk, and he writes a whole history of this period, and they're generally quite supportive of William. He's their man, but the harrying of the north is quite often the point at which these chroniclers will say, this is when William went too far, this is when we can't support what William has done, this is where we want to distance ourselves slightly, this is where he will be incurring God's wrath, because the harrying of the north is just a horrific moment that everybody accepts is a step too far.
Hmm. Okay, let's move on to another important thing, and that is, and I'm going to bring it up now, and that is weaponry. Now, the longbow, it's well known, obviously, during this period that this is started to be used. But this is like a machine gun of the time, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about the longbow and its effect on the battlefield and how it's used and when it's used.
This is, for a long time, this is the game changer for the English army on the continent. It's something that particularly French armies struggle to get to grips with. It will take them centuries to work out how to oppose the longbow effectively. So mostly on the continent, everywhere is familiar with bows and crossbows, and you will often see a mix of those things in armies. In general terms, on the continent, they tend to favour the crossbow. So you get people like the Genoese who will be professional crossbowmen. They will be the mercenary crossbowman armies that people will hire. And the longbow, the warbow, is much more of an English and Welsh thing, really. And the English and Welsh become terrifyingly proficient with these bows. So these bows can be 6 foot or more. They can weigh, sort of have 120, 150 pound draw weight, which, you know, is an incredibly hard thing to pull, a warbow like this. And they will fire an arrow hundreds and hundreds of feet. And so they will outrange a crossbow generally. They will have a higher rate of fire than a crossbow. A crossbow requires you to reload it and rewind it and reset the mechanism. So you might fire one crossbow bolt in a minute, during which time a longbowman might have fired anywhere from 8 to 12 arrows. And if you multiply that, say an average of 10 arrows a minute, by 5,000 archers on a field, you've got 50,000 arrows a minute being fired. That is absolutely terrifying to have all of those things. You get these arrow storms that people talk about and these clouds of arrows. That's where this comes from. So as you said, it's exactly like a machine gun compared to having a pistol on a battlefield. And they prove to be absolutely devastating. So we see the English sort of experimenting with and refining the use of the crossbow through the 100 Years' War, really. So this is the story of the longbow as a devastating weapon on the battlefield. And what you see through that period is the ratio of men-at-arms to archers being experimented with and played around with. It generally falls into having maybe 3 archers for every man-at-arms. It can be 5 archers for every man-at-arms. Those ratios sort of move around. But the fact that you will generally have way more archers than foot soldiers demonstrates the importance of them. And what they're particularly good for is that there's lots of argument about how you fire the warbow, in the sense of, do you have these kind of looping shots, so the arrow storm, or do you flat fire them directly at your enemy? And my interpretation is that you can do both of those things with them, because what archers are really good for at the start of a battle is forcing your opponent to move. So 2 medieval armies will be looking to get the best piece of ground they can, the high ground. Give it up, Anakin, I have the high ground. It's exactly what every medieval army is trying to do. And they don't want to move. Generally, in medieval warfare, the army that moves first will lose. So the longbow is a great way. You fire several thousand arrows into the midst of an enemy, and it will very quickly become clear that they can't just stand there and take this. It forces them to move where you want them to be. And then when they get within sort of range that you feel you can pick targets, then maybe you can fire flat and directly at them. And this is where the power of an arrow hitting you would knock someone off a horse. It would go through plate armor, and it would be an absolutely devastating weapon. And you can put different heads on your arrows. So some will be aimed at getting through armor, some will be aimed at doing damage to flesh, some will be specifically designed to injure horses, for example, to halt cavalry charges and things like that. So you have so many options for what to do with this. And as I say, the 100 Years' War from the 14th to the 15th century is the story of the success of the English warbow. The trouble really then is that it breeds a little bit of complacency, and that the English think, well, we've got this devastating weapon that works every time. We don't need to tinker with this anymore. And in the meantime, the French begin to invest in artillery, guns, cannon, and things like that. And that's where you see it begin to switch. When they start refining those things by the middle of the 15th century, the English kind of have no answer to it then, because they've had this tactic for 100 or so years and they simply don't know any other way to fight by that point. The epilogue of this, I guess, really is that after the 100 Years' War, the fallout from that is sort of the Wars of the Roses, a big civil war at home that's almost a result of the failures in France. And the issue that you get with lots of the battle in the Wars of the Roses is that it's English armies fighting English armies, so they're fighting in exactly the same way, yet these huge arrow duels trying to move each other around, and the tactics begin to almost negate each other because no side has an innovation anymore, because the innovation that's worked on the continent for 100 years is now old hat, and it's all that either side know how to do. So some of those battles are really tricky to call, and they're quite close fought things for a long time.
That's fascinating. It really is. So was there not anyone thinking, well, let's start using gunpowder ourselves? Was there nobody like sort of pushing that move towards, better weaponry?
Cannon in particular have been around for a little while. The first use by the English of a cannon on a battlefield is at Crécy in 1346, and this is the great innovation of Edward III. And he's not particularly using the cannon believing that it's going to kill lots and lots of people. I mean, definitely if you can fire a a gunstone into a crowd, it's going to do some damage. The reason that Edward III puts cannon there, they exist as a siege weapon, so they're designed to blow up walls and things like that. The reason that he puts them there is that the French are coming with a huge cavalry force. Cannon make a lot of noise. If you think in the medieval world, the loudest thing you've probably heard is a clap of thunder or the church bells ringing in the local church. You don't have that kind of loud noise that we associate with much of the world today. I get motorbikes going past here and tractors, and you've never been to a loud concert or anything like that. So gunfire, cannon fire is terrifying. You go to a battle reenactment today, and when they fire the cannon, you can see people all around the place jump even today. So you think of the terror that would inspire in 1346 in the people, but also in the horses. And it was designed to be more of a terror weapon than something that was going to actually kill lots and lots of people and change the course of the battle. And then you don't really see the English being too interested in guns until the Wars of the Roses. So the Earl of Warwick, for example, the Kingmaker in the Wars of the Roses, will begin to import mercenaries from the continent who know how to fire guns. But they're not always the most predictable things still. They can blow up in the face of the person using them as often as they will cause damage to the opposition. So the English are quite slow to adopt some of that technology, primarily because they've got the longbow that works so well. Why would you mess with that? Why would you invest in something else? So they get a little bit complacent, and they don't take up gunpowder weapons as quickly as other places do, I think.
Yeah. And I've got to ask something about longbow. There's this mythology that, and I'm not going to do it on camera, but apparently the English used to stick their two fingers up at the French, and that was to do with the fact, obviously, that's the two fingers you use to draw the bow. And basically, if they caught them, apparently they would cut their two fingers off. Now, is there any truth behind that?
No, which is a shame because it's a brilliant story.
I know. I'm upset now. No, I'm only joking.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but yeah, the story goes that any captured archer would have those two fingers cut off so that he couldn't pull a bow anymore. So that sticking your two fingers up at the French was a way to demonstrate that you'd never been captured. I can still use a bow. You've still got to look out for me. But unfortunately, it's a myth that sprung up a bit later. There's no evidence that it happened during the medieval period, I'm afraid.
I had to ask that because it's something that I've thought about. I think about a lot because I live really close to France. But anyway, I didn't look around. Right, so now there is going to be something really, really important, and there's going to be another shift in the way things are, and that is, of course, the rise of the Plantagenets. And so this is really important period, isn't it? So just give us a little sense of the rise of the Plantagenets.
Yeah, so the Plantagenet family, that as we will call them now, are the longest reigning royal family in English history. I mean, you can make a case for the Stuarts ruling longer in Scotland, so I'm not going to say British, I'm going to say English. And essentially, we have the Norman kings who will run through. Then we go through this period that we know as the Anarchy, so a civil war between Stephen and Matilda, where Stephen is still connected to the Norman family. Empress Matilda is the daughter of Henry I, who is in many ways the last Norman king. And that sort of lasts up until 1154, when Stephen passes away. And he's reached this agreement throughout this civil war in the last couple of years. He's reached an agreement with Matilda's son, who is another Henry, that he will effectively adopt Henry, and when Stephen dies, Henry will succeed him. So in 1154, we get Henry II, who is the man that we will remember as the first Plantagenet king. So at the time, they would have been referred to probably as the Angevins, because they come from Anjou. So someone from Anjou is called an Angevin. So we get this period also being known as the Angevin kingship, the Angevin Empire. And Henry, for me, Henry II is possibly the most talented and gifted and in many ways successful man ever to sit on the throne of England or Britain. I think he's absolutely incredible, the things that he achieves. And this is a man who is in control of England, most of Wales, most of Ireland. He has nominal overlordship of Scotland. He's Duke of Normandy. He's in control of Brittany. He's Count of Anjou, Maine, Touraine, in the centre of France. He marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, which gives him control of the Duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest of France. So he has this huge empire that runs from kind of Hadrian's Wall to the Pyrenees Mountains. And that is a significant piece of land that nobody's seen anything that size in Europe probably since Charlemagne, really, in the 9th century. And so the problem that this creates is that the King of France in particular sees him as a threat. So Henry owns more of France than the King of France does, which makes him look like a huge, huge threat. And that really sets up the rivalry that will dominate much of the rest of the medieval period, and arguably continue up until, the Napoleonic War and stuff like that. This is when we become the traditional rivals of France. I think that is a Plantagenet legacy, particularly of Henry II, because the Capetian kings in France will desperately try to find ways to unseat the kings of England and to kick them out of particularly that continental land. And English kings will always have this claim to those lands that Henry II had, because they were once property of the English king, and why shouldn't they be again? So we get kind of Henry II, and then we get, such incredible names as Richard the Lionheart, the great crusading king. We get the disastrous King John, who is, just an absolute idiot, a bit of a plank, causes all kinds of problems. His son Henry III is the longest reigning medieval king of England. Very few people know anything about Henry III. He kind of slips under the radar, but an absolutely fascinating character. And it continues through Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, Richard II, and takes us really, the end of Plantagenet kingship doesn't come until the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, when the Tudors arrive. So you then get the 15th century is a story of a bit of infighting in the Plantagenet family. So Richard II is deposed by his first cousin, who becomes Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. His son is Henry V. His son is Henry VI, who comes to the throne at 9 months old. And that will ultimately lead up to the Wars of the Roses, when the House of York, another set of cousins, will supplant the House of Lancaster. And then they will be swept away by the arrival of the Tudors in 1485. And that's the point at which we kind of end the Plantagenet dynasty. So you get kind of 334 years of the Plantagenet kings, during which so much of what we associate with England is being born and moulded. The systems of government, the structures, the nature of Parliament emerges during the reign of Henry III. Parliament is a Plantagenet legacy. Some of the things that are absolutely central to Britain today come out of this fascinating medieval period of English history.
Yeah, totally agree. And of course, his contribution to Kent, and I believe he liked Kent a lot, is Dover Castle, and I spend a lot of time down there. The great keep there is just amazing. And from what I understand, so you go on about the rivalry between England and France, I believe that Dover was built to receive the French king.
Foreign dignitaries in general, but the French king in particular. So Kent, obviously, also the home to the drama around Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. And so shortly after Becket is killed, he is made a saint. So the French king, his son falls ill, essentially, and he decides to come over to England to make a pilgrimage to the tomb of Thomas Becket to pray for his son. And this seems to be the moment that makes Henry II think, I don't have, a great big wonderful castle where I can receive someone as important as the King of France and show him how important I am in my own kingdom. And so he refurbishes and rebuilds Dover Castle. It's a great place to receive people from France. It's maybe the first thing some people coming over the channel will see. It's a statement piece that makes a really big impression. And Henry wanted it to say, you're in England now, you're in my backyard, and look how incredibly powerful I am. I've got a castle like this. And this is the first thing that you're going to see when you arrive. So he invests a lot in Dover Castle. And Dover Castle will play a critical part in the First Barons' War in 1216-17 that follows on from Magna Carta. Dover Castle will be laid siege to for a long, long time, and it will survive that siege. And Dover Castle has this incredible history that goes all the way into the Cold War. There are tunnels underneath Dover Castle that were used in the 20th century. So it's an incredibly strategically important place, a fabulous building that you can go and see today. And again, it's a legacy of Henry II's desire to show how powerful and how wealthy he was.
Yeah. And I can, even today, so when I drive, so I'm in Folkestone, I drive into Dover, and the first thing you see when you get down there is that imposing, castle. And it's just, again, that view hasn't really changed for, 900 years. And, once when I did come back from France, you can see it halfway across the channel on a clear day. So I get what he was trying to do. It's just an amazing place. And I will say that just recently they've revamped the tunnels, the medieval tunnels that they used during the siege of 1216. And they've also got a great new display there, which they've just recently opened up. So I'd encourage people to go and have a look, because it's amazing. And as Matt said, layer upon layer of history. You've even got a Roman lighthouse and a Saxon church, and I mean, it's literally 2,000 years of history. It's like a time capsule. But yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned the Barons' War, because that was going to be my next thing. Because as you said, Henry II, he has all this massive empire, and of course, as we know, Richard the Lionheart is gonna die in a battle in France, isn't he? And then, of course, the throne's going to pass to John, and John's just going to undo and unpick everything that his father worked so hard for, didn't he?
It's hard to find a polite word that is bad enough to describe John. He's just atrocious in every way. So we get lots of ideas of what he's like earlier in his life. His father had planned for him to be Lord of Ireland, so he's going to put John in charge of Ireland when he partitioned up all of his properties. And we have this story of John going over to Ireland as a young man, as a 18-year-old, and he meets all of the Irish lords, and he essentially sets to taking the mickey out of them. And one of the sources describes John pulling the Irish lords' beards, and in some cases pulling their beards out. So he's yanking so hard on these men's beards that he's pulling fistfuls of their hair out, and he thinks this is funny, and he thinks this is the way to behave. And so when John becomes king, he's spent much of Richard's reign desperately trying to manoeuvre against Richard, allying himself with the King of France whenever he needs to do it, when it suits him. And John is just, all of the signals are there that John is going to be a disaster as king, and he doesn't disappoint. He is an absolute disaster. The problem that John really has, so we have bad kings in history, we have cruel kings, we have warmongers, we have weak people as king who can't keep control. The real issue with John is that he is deeply unpredictable. You can be a bad king as long as everyone knows you're bad. As long as they know how you're going to react in lots of situations, then the nobility can cope with you being a bad king. What John does is set them all on edge, because they never know from one day to the next. One day you're his favourite, the next day he's fining you hundreds of pounds, driving you into bankruptcy, and hunting you across Wales and Ireland in a desperate effort to cut your head off. you just don't know what you're ever going to get, and that works for nobody. And so John's reign, he falls out with Rome. We have this long period in the 12 noughties when England is under interdict from Rome, so they're expelled from the family of the Catholic Church. And this is, for a Christian nation in the medieval world, this is the ultimate sanction. You can't go to church, you can't get married, you can't get buried. They will baptize children perhaps, but that is the absolute limit of what's happening. And for people whose daily and weekly lives revolve around church bells and church services and the belief that everything you do in this life is to try and get you into heaven, the removal of all of that is catastrophic. But all John sees is the fact that he's getting rich from this, because all of a sudden all of the money that would have gone to Rome in tithes and taxes and Peter's pence and all of that kind of stuff is going into John's coffers instead. So he's just getting richer and richer and richer. So he sees absolutely no desire to solve this problem. And so he ends up between this mix of utter disinterest in restoring a relationship with the church and his dangerous unpredictability. He upsets the majority of his barons, particularly in the north. And we get this situation where they begin this revolt against him that will ultimately lead to them imposing Magna Carta on him. And the essential thrust of Magna Carta for the purposes of this is that it places the king beneath the law. Previous to this, effectively, the law was whatever the king said it was, and you couldn't use the law against the king. So what Magna Carta says is, no, if we have a law of the land, then the law will be settled and decided, and it will apply to the king. You can't sort of exempt yourself from the provisions of the law of the land. And so 1215, John is forced to put his seal to Magna Carta at Runnymede. He immediately tears it up. He writes to the Pope, because in the meantime, the way that John has rebuilt the relationship with the church is to effectively give England to the papacy. And again, this is something that isn't very often talked about. John makes England a vassal state of the Pope. He makes kings of England subservient to the Pope. And he does that in perpetuity. And there is no moment when this is actually undone until the Reformation, the break with the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century by Henry VIII. So theoretically, for the whole of the rest of the medieval period, England belongs to Rome. Nobody kind of really talks about it too much after the 13th century, but it's never actually undone. And so John writes to the Pope as his overlord and says, look what they've done to me. And the Pope says, no, you can't do this. He threatens to excommunicate anyone who abides by Magna Carta. So John tears it up. So the barons immediately fly back into open revolt. And at this point, they get to the point where they now want to just do away with John. They want to dethrone John. And the best option they can come up with is to go over to France and to offer the crown of England to the son of the King of France. So this is Louis the Lion. And they invite him essentially to come over to England and be the new king. So you have rebel barons in the north of England, a French invasion, which ends up taking much of the southeast of England and including London, which is constantly squeezing John until kind of 1216. He is tearing around the kingdom, desperately trying to fight these fires everywhere, and eventually falls ill and dies. And in many ways, it's a cruel thing to say about John, but it's hard to say that it's not right, that people say the best thing that John ever did was to die when he did.
Yeah, it's a really interesting period. I would, if people want to delve more deeper into it. Firstly, I did do a podcast on the Barons' War, so please go and give that a watch and a listen. But again, also you see one of the first sort of naval battles off the Kent coast as well, don't you? Towards the end, where the Prince of France is on his way back, I believe, in 1217, around that sort of time. It's a really interesting period. It really is.
Yeah, so that naval battle is really interesting too, because you've got such famous figures as William Marshall floating around this time. The Battle of Lincoln, which Marshall fights in his 60s, manages to win, and then he wants to go and take part in this naval battle at Sandwich, but they sort of don't allow him to do it because they're getting a little bit worried about what's going on. But you get this incident where the English Navy sail out to meet the French that are coming across to bring reinforcements. and the English army suddenly veer off and go in a different direction, sort of behind the French armada. And the French we're told, the French are laughing and jeering and calling the English cowards. But what the English have actually done is go around the back of them to catch the wind. So then they're approaching quickly from behind, and with the wind behind them. And the important part for the wind being behind them is not just the speed, but they begin to use barrels of quicklime. So it's this powdered lime that's quite often used for mortar, but it's a really dangerous caustic substance. And so they start to use this as like a form of chemical warfare. They throw barrels of quicklime up in the air, slingshot it onto the French ships, and anywhere that this touches you where you're wet, it burns like fire. So it gets in your eyes, gets in your mouth, gets anywhere that you're sweaty, and it burns and burns and burns. And we're told that the French sailors are blinded, thrown into an absolute panic, and the English are effectively then able to easily win this naval engagement. So you get all of these really fascinating stories going on in the midst of the Magna Carta crisis.
Mm-hmm. And again, people, medieval period is so interesting. You've really got to start delving into this stuff. Now, just quickly, Matt, about Magna Carta again. How important is that document as far as the future of the world is concerned? Because I know, the US Constitution, I believe, is adopted from Magna Carta. Is that correct?
It's something that's really argued over the importance of Magna Carta. So you can see Magna Carta as a list of very specific demands in 1215 from a bunch of rich elite barons who are unhappy. So it's about addressing their concerns, really. It does say that it applies to all free men, but we probably need to remember that perhaps maybe a third of people in England at this point are free. Maybe as many as 2/3 of the population are unfree, so it doesn't apply to them at all. There are parts of it, so there's a Charter of the Forest that sits alongside Magna Carta. Charter of the Forest probably has more impact on ordinary people. But this idea that you can have this written document that sets the king beneath the law. So 1215 Magna Carta is set aside, it's utterly written off, it's destroyed. The Magna Carta that survives is a reissue from 1225, which is slightly different to the 1215 document in some technical ways. And I think the important thing is less about the words that Magna Carta uses, although some of those words are important. So the idea that, to no man will we sell justice or delay justice, and that you can't be tried unless it's by a jury of your peers and that kind of thing. So all of this will come out of Magna Carta. And I think it's this idea that you can have a written document that sets out the law for everybody, including the elite and including the king, and it excludes nobody, that is important. So when America is looking to settle its constitution when it becomes an independent country, it is looking to things like Magna Carta for how you can do that, how you would structure those documents. So a set of clauses that can be added to and amended later is precisely what the American Constitution is. So the content, I think, is perhaps less important than the ideas that Magna Carta sows in having a written document that sets out what the law is at the highest possible level, which is a slightly odd thing because the UK still doesn't have a written constitution. Magna Carta is a document, but we have this weird, amorphous, unwritten constitution in the UK, unlike places like America that have taken perhaps an example from Magna Carta and expanded that to create these written constitutions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's an interesting point. Okay, Matt. So we're gonna move on a little bit now to 1381, and there's a horrible thing called the Black Death, and then we get the Peasants' Revolt. I've always found this really fascinating. So, what's your view on the Peasants' Revolt? And of course, you get one of the first beheadings on Tower Hill, and all sorts of things going on. So, tell us a little bit about the Peasants' Revolt.
It is an absolutely fascinating period. So, I mean, just by way of a little plug, I did a 3-part documentary series for History Hit that I absolutely loved creating.
Yeah.
That looks at some of the real people that are involved in the revolt. So not just the famous people, the dukes and the kings, but the ordinary people who got wrapped up in it. I mean, we made that series, I think, because you think about what world were they living in 1381 post-pandemic. There's a cost of living crisis. There is huge inflation. There is a higher than ever tax burden. There's war in Europe. You know, it could almost be today.
Yeah, that's weird.
You know, it is so parallel to what is going on. The Black Death wipes out, again, the numbers are argued over, so somewhere between 25 and 50% of populations where it touches communities, perhaps even more in some places. If you manage to survive the Black Death, weirdly you're in quite a good position initially, because suddenly there is a lot less labour to work the same amount of land. You might have inherited land from lots and lots of relatives who've passed away, and as sad as that is, suddenly you're richer than you thought you would ever be, and wages can be driven up because there is now a shortage of labour. But the government steps in and they effectively suppress wages, and they put laws in place that say wages can only be pre-pandemic levels of pay, and you can't get paid any more than that. So all of this new opportunity that has come out of this disaster, the government are crushing effectively, because it suits the landed elite to maintain the status quo. And ultimately 1381 is a story of lots of things coming together, but primarily taxation is what drives people into revolt finally. So this is a period in which we have several poll taxes, and poll tax is still such a dirty word in England today, 700 years later, 650 years later, that when Margaret Thatcher introduces the community tax in the 1980s, people call it the poll tax. It wasn't a poll tax, it was the community charge, but people hated it so much that they called it a poll tax because that inspired revolt in 1381.
Yeah.
So we still have it as a dirty word in the English mind today. But essentially this is experiments with taxation, which becomes increasingly unfair and unreasonable to pay for the war in France, which isn't going very well under the government of Richard II, who comes to the throne at 10 years old. By the time of the Peasants' Revolt, he's 13 years old. So still too young to be ruling himself, really. And ultimately, in the end, the government orders a reassessment of taxation because they're not raising as much money as they want. It turns out that communities, particularly in the southeast, so in your neck of the woods, Daz, people of Kent, pretty awful at hiding people. What they do is they say, yeah, there used to be 20,000 people that live here now. There's only 15,000. We don't know where the other 5 have gone. They've just vanished. But they can't pay tax because they're not here anymore. And this makes the government suspicious, quite rightly. What communities are doing is hiding their numbers to reduce the tax burden for those who can't afford to pay it. But the government sends in these tax assessors who, they're rifling through people's private affairs, and medieval people aren't used to that kind of invasion of their homes and their privacy, and so they react against it. And you get these gatherings of men who begin to march on London. And the important aspect of this as well is that we're still in the thick of the 100 Years' War. England is a very militarised society. Lots and lots of the men in the southeast of England in particular will have served in France. They will have military experience. They will know how to use a bow. They may well own rudimentary armour, and they will know how to wield a weapon because they've been trained to do it. And they're putting all of that into action to organise themselves in England. They get to London and they ask for a meeting with the king. And on the first day, Richard II is rowed down the River Thames on a barge to meet the rebels at Rotherhithe. And the barge comes round a bend in the Thames, and they see these tens of thousands of rebels on the bank of the Thames. And the king's advisors, hightail it. They're absolutely not going to allow the teenage king to wade into the middle of all of this. They turn the barge around and go back to the Tower of London. And this just enrages the crowd. So they cross the London Bridge through Southwark, over London Bridge, and they begin to take control of the city. And they're welcomed. Lots of people in London share their concerns and their grievances. And what we get then is a couple of days of lawlessness in London. The Savoy Palace, which belongs to John of Gaunt, who is the richest and probably the most hated man in England, who happens to be in Scotland at the time, so he manages to get away from the site of it. But the Savoy Palace is burned to the ground, and it's burned so completely that it's never rebuilt. It's on the site where the Savoy Hotel is now, but they never rebuild a palace there. They just leave this blackened, smouldering ruin for the rest of the medieval period. And essentially then we have a couple of days in which Richard II does agree to meet with the rebels as things get out of hand, and they tell him they want the abolition of serfdom. So we talked a little bit earlier about the idea that lots of people in England aren't free, so they're tied to a piece of land and they're still considered to be the property of the lord of that land. And the main thrust of the people's demands here is that those people should be set free, that there should be an end to serfdom. So again, we call it the Peasants' Revolt, which it was never called at the time, and that gives us the notion that this is lots of very, very poor people desperately trying to make a point. But there are lots of what we might recognise as middle-class people, so merchants and landowners from the countryside are wrapped up in this too, trying to get a fairer world for people around them. People aren't just selfishly pursuing their own aims during this revolt. They're described as peasants because that's a variation on the word rustic, and rustic simply meant anyone who didn't live in a town or city, so anyone in the countryside, and that could be quite wealthy people too. But ultimately this will end on a day in June, on the second time Richard meets the rebels. The rebels leader, Wat Tyler, is negotiating with Richard, and there's a bit of a scuffle. We're not quite sure what causes it. Some sources say that he spoke out of turn to the king. Some say that he reached up and grabbed the king's horse's reins. But something happens, and the Mayor of London essentially lunges forward and stabs Wat Tyler. And then the Mayor of London's squire draws his sword and runs Wat Tyler through and kills him. And this is the point at which, you know, the teenage King Richard II will ride out to the rebels and tell them that he offers himself as their leader, and he encourages them to go home. And I think at this point the rebels have realised they've probably gone a bit too far. Things have got out of hand, and they do decide to disperse. And ultimately they've got what they want. Richard agrees to abolish serfdom and allow everybody to be free. But as soon as the people go, the government undoes everything that Richard has done, and they begin to withdraw these promises of freedom. The documents that everyone has gone home with are undone and made void before they even get home, but people are acting on the basis of these documents that they have, and then they're tried as criminals because those documents have been voided before they've even got back home. So you have this long aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt that doesn't get talked about, in which people are being prosecuted. There's a battle in Norfolk a few days after the events in London, a pitched battle, and there are people as far away as Yorkshire and Somerset who are acting on the basis of these promises that the king has given them, which are then whipped away. And you know, this obviously doesn't sit well for the country. It doesn't seem to sit particularly well with Richard II. He will spend the rest of his reign feeling like his nobles have unreasonably restrained him and haven't treated him fairly, and he will lash out in all sorts of directions. And this, I think, is partly what will doom his reign, and he will be deposed by his cousin in 1399. That's a really long-winded explanation of barely scratching the surface of the Peasants' Revolt. So.
Yeah, but that was really interesting. I really appreciate that, and I do want to go back a teeny bit, because obviously Simon Sudbury and Sir Robert Hales are going to feel the full force of the peasants, aren't they? Or as you said, they're not really peasants, and of course they are pulled out the Tower of London, aren't they? And they're beheaded on Tower Hill. Is that correct?
Yeah. So on that first day when Richard talks to the rebels, he essentially promises an end to serfdom, and the other thing that the rebels particularly ask for is the arrest of Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who until the previous day had been the Chancellor. So the Chancellor in medieval England is the most senior figure in government beneath the king. We might think of it something like the Prime Minister today. It's that kind of importance in government. And Robert Hales was the Treasurer. So these are two of the key men in what the people view as a failing government that is squandering money and placing unfair, unreasonable taxation onto the people. And Richard agrees to these men being arrested and tried. And he says, you know, as long as they get a proper trial, as long as they get due process of the law, then yes, you can arrest them and put them on trial. And there is then this delegation that goes off to the Tower of London. And this is often framed as the only time in its history that the Tower of London has been breached by an army. But it seems, from some of the sources that we have, it seems much more likely that the people were let in. Some of the sources talk about them shaking hands with the guards at the tower and greeting them as friends and things like that, because they probably had writs from the king for the arrest of Simon Sudbury and Lord Hale and Robert Hales, the treasurer. So they seem to be let into the tower. They pour through, the buildings of the tower. They get to the White Tower. They will find Simon Sudbury and Robert Hales hiding there. As a side note to this, the future Henry IV, so that first Lancastrian king who will depose Richard II in 1399, is also in the building and ends up hiding in a cupboard to get away from the rebels, because he's the son of John of Gaunt, that man they hate so much they've burnt down the Savoy Palace. So he may well have been at serious risk from the people of the Peasants' Revolt, and he ends up being hidden away in a cupboard. And the peasants then, so the rebels, they drag Simon Sudbury and Robert Hales out to Tower Hill and they execute them. And the obvious problem with this is in direct contravention to what Richard has said. He wants these men to have a proper trial, due process of the law. And the rebels have instantly gone against that. And in a bit of a bloodlust maybe, they've executed these two men that they blame primarily for the state of the country, and the two men that they can get their hands on. They can't get John of Gaunt. And so this seems to be a moment that to some extent knocks the wheels off the Peasants' Revolt, because they've now disobeyed the king. They've broken their contract, their deal with the king. So those two executions, as you're showing there, they're remembered as the first ones on Tower Hill, but they are incredibly significant moments in English history, because it maybe undoes some of the absolutely what would have been revolutionary aims of the Peasants' Revolt.
Yeah. And of course, if you would like to go and see Simon Sudbury's skull, you can, can't you? Because it's in St Gregory's Church in Sudbury itself, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, we went to see it for the documentary. So they recovered his head. It was spiked on London Bridge as a traitor, but then it was recovered and taken back to Sudbury, to his hometown. And they have this kind of mummified head in a little alcove in a back room. You can ask at the church, and if there's someone there, they will normally show you where this head is. It's incredibly weird. It's just a mummified head in a little alcove in the wall. It's quite morbid, but there's a facial reconstruction being done of it too, so you can get to see what they think is a really realistic face of Simon Sudbury.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, and again, it's something that I'm dying to do. I don't know why. I thought it was a bit weird. Okay, and I know you've talked about this next, and again, we're going to sort of like start winding it down now. But you've talked about this period, and this period, of course, this next period is very complex and very lots going on, as you know, because you've talked about it quite a lot already, and that is the War of the Roses. So, the best you can, Matt, give us a quick overview of that.
Oh, wow, yeah, we're going to be here for at least another hour or two.
Yeah.
The Wars of the Roses is very much what I call my history home. So this is my area of real fascination in the medieval period. And essentially what you get is the war in France falls apart. The 100 Years' War is going disastrously for England by the middle of the 15th century. It's generally seen as ending in 1453, when the English are defeated at the Battle of Castillon. Henry VI has come to the throne in 1422 on the death of his father, Henry V. So Henry V, remembered as a great warrior king of Agincourt, and gets to the point where he is heir to the Kingdom of France, succeeded by his son at 9 months old. And long minorities are just disasters, because they are power vacuums into which lots of people will insert themselves and make hay while the sun shines. And throughout the 1440s in particular, you get lots of different ideas at court. So should we make peace with France? Should we accept that we can't win this war and find the best way to peace and start rebuilding trade? Or should we continue to fight for what Henry V had won in France and fight for the English kingdom of France? Henry VI will turn out to be in favour of the peace policy, and so there is this rival faction that want war, and they will increasingly be excluded from government. And Richard, Duke of York, is a man who will get wrapped up in that war faction. It's actually not clear that he was particularly keen on being involved, but he gets sucked into it by the leaders of that faction. And so he becomes isolated. And then through the 1450s, you get these desperate attempts to reconcile Richard, Duke of York, particularly with the Beaufort family, who are the Dukes of Somerset. So Edmund Beaufort will become a really intense personal rival of Richard, Duke of York. And the early parts of the Wars of the Roses, so it's often dated to beginning at the First Battle of St Albans in 1455. But this is really a fight between Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, about who should be chief advisor to the king, really. And York wins that battle. But he doesn't win the confidence of Henry VI, so he still finds himself excluded frequently from government. And then war begins to erupt again in 1459, when York tries to impose himself again militarily. He ends up being forced into exile in Ireland. He's attainted in Parliament as a traitor, so he's deprived of all of his lands and titles. And I think at this point, left with nothing to lose, he finally comes back and makes his claim to the throne of England. So in 1460, this becomes a dynastic dispute about who should be the rightful king of England. And it's kind of taken York 10 years to get there. So I always think that York is not the madly ambitious person people often think he was. I think he tried desperately not to take this step, actually. But he claims the throne. We end up with a compromise, which is known as the Act of Accord, which says that, yes, York's claim is perfectly good, but there is no reason to dethrone Henry VI. So Henry will remain king for the rest of his life, and then he'll be succeeded by York and his heirs. Like most compromises, this pleases nobody, really, and it particularly outrages Henry VI's wife, who has just seen her son dispossessed. So we get battles in the north of England, and essentially the Lancastrians will lose, the House of York will win. Richard, Duke of York, is killed. His oldest son becomes Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England, after the Battle of Towton in 1461, which is this huge sort of big apocalyptic battle that decides that Edward is going to be king. Everything looks okay then until the 1469, 1470, when Edward begins to fall out with his cousin, because everybody's a cousin. If you've got a cousin, beware of your cousins, because it's always the cousins who are coming for people here. Edward will fall out with his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, who is remembered as the kingmaker. Warwick will decide to put Henry VI back on the throne, so you have this brief revival of Lancastrian kingship before Edward, after being forced into exile, comes back again and retakes the throne, at which point Henry VI dies / is killed. It's really unclear. He's probably killed. And then everything looks okay for the House of York. They look set until Edward dies unexpectedly in 1483 at the age of just 40. There is at least 57 more podcasts in what happens in 1483. But essentially, Edward's son, Edward V, will be set aside. It's decided that he's illegitimate, and instead Edward's brother will become Richard III. It's obviously way more complicated than that. People will have lots of opinions about it, but probably don't have time to get into that right now. And then Richard III will struggle to impose himself as King of England, faces a rebellion in October 1483, and then for the remainder of his reign, the big threat emerges as this guy called Henry Tudor, who's a bit of a nobody. He's been in exile for most of his life, half of his life by the time he comes back to England, and he nevertheless begins to draw people to him and will invade England in 1485, fight Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, and I think utterly unexpectedly to everybody, probably including Henry Tudor will see his forces win that battle and will be crowned as Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch of a new dynasty, and that is the end of the Plantagenets, and is quite often viewed as the hard cut-off date for the end of the medieval period too, which is a bit arbitrary, really.
Yeah, well, fantastic job in doing it in that sort of time. That was great, Matt. But yeah, brilliant. Really appreciate that. Yeah, and again, as Matt said, that is technically the end of that period, and we see the Tudor period start. And of course, that's another minefield, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I always say though, the Tudors are much less complicated than the Wars of the Roses. If you want some really in-depth history that is absolutely labyrinthine, that you will never manage to get your head around. I've been studying the Wars of the Roses probably for 30 years, and I don't know half of it probably. There
No.
are so many local family feuds going on, so many things that are connected to everything else. You know, the Tudors are dead simple. You know, they're a bunch of unpleasant people who begin executing women. There's not much more to it than that. Henry VIII is a bit of a stroppy guy who falls out with the Pope. You
Yeah.
want some real complex, deep history, go to the Wars of the Roses.
Definitely, and again, you know, those all those podcasts and those documentaries done. Go and watch them, you know, because it is a fascinating period, and it's something again I've only scratched the surface of, and I'm involved in so much. I wish I could deep dive into it. So, okay, we're going to talk about something really important now, Matt, and that is, of course, the History Hit Guide to Medieval England. And of course, we've covered some of those topics, but of course, the book covers quite a few other topics as well, which are important. Just quickly, how satisfying is it to see your name on the cover of the book? And again, you know, tell us about how you got this together and what the idea was.
Yeah, I mean, it's always an honour to see a name on the front of a book, and to ever see it on bookshelves in bookshops and things like that, and to see on social media that people are reading it and hopefully enjoying it is a source of endless pleasure. If you don't enjoy it, please just don't tell me. But it was a great book to get together because we, you know, as the subtitle says there, we sort of start at the Vikings. We don't go into too much detail about Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. That's a little bit of scene setting for how England emerges. And we go all the way up to Bosworth and the arrival of the Tudors. And that is a period in which England becomes a country. It goes from being this fractured set of kingdoms that boils down to the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, so the 7 main kingdoms, and then is consolidated into one nation that becomes England. It's the period in which the exchequer emerges as a form of taxation, a way of raising money for the government that still exists today. It's a time in which Parliament emerges. And then you can throw into all of that too some incredible people. So we mentioned William Marshall. You know, this guy has the most astonishing career. He's often remembered as the greatest knight of the medieval era. He was literally a legend in his own lifetime. He was a servant to several kings of England, ends up being regent to the young Henry III. You can chuck in Eleanor of Aquitaine. You can throw in, you know, crusading efforts, popular revolts in England. There is just so much going on in the medieval period, and just to be able to try and take a fairly high level overview of all of that and string it all together as a narrative that navigates that complex history in a way that is hopefully digestible and helps to understand how we arrived at the England that we have today and the Britain that we have today. Hopefully people will enjoy it, but you know, I have to say I enjoyed putting it together.
Yeah, and is it sort of like a little bit of a gateway drug to the medieval world, and sort of like, so if they, you know, like you said, all different periods and different time periods, that obviously you're hopefully someone to go, oh, that's interesting. They have more of a deep dive. Was that sort of an idea behind it as well?
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, sometimes this whole period can be so complex that it's intimidating, and you don't want to go in, or you don't know a good open door or a window that you can get through. And this book was designed to be something like that. So one of the great pleasures of doing the Gone Medieval podcast is that I get to talk to incredible experts about this whole period. So I'm learning all of the time that I'm doing it. And what we did with this book that I think was quite innovative, it includes a load of QR codes. So where we talk about Magna Carta, for example, obviously we can't go into too much depth about Magna Carta, but we've got a QR code in there that if you scan it with the camera on your phone will take you to the episode of Gone Medieval that we did with Professor David Carpenter about Magna Carta. So at various points scattered through the book, if you want more detail than the book has space to give you, you can go away and find it. But equally, if you're not that interested, you can keep going through the main narrative and not get bogged down in detail that you're not interested in or you don't particularly want. So hopefully it offers a really nice open door, a welcome into the medieval period with opportunities to go and find out more depth where you want it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea with the QR code. I don't think many people have done that. That's really good because again, you know, we rely on our phones so much now, and that's a great idea. So, any final thoughts before we wrap up the podcast, Matt?
I think just the medieval period is fascinating. It is foundational. There is so much that goes on. You can throw in Anglo-Saxons, you can throw in Vikings, you can throw in Normans, you can throw in Plantagenets. You've got battles and wars, you've got interesting individuals in there, but you've also got this overarching story of how we became who we are today, how we arrived in 2024 at Britain looking like the way it does. You want to know why there are castles dotted around the landscape? It's in this book. If you want to know why there are churches and cathedrals built the way that they are, dominating towns and cities, it's in this book. If you want to understand the institutions of government and the impact that the medieval world had on familiar things like the Exchequer today, it's in this book. So hopefully there is something in there for everybody, whether you just want the war stories, whether you want to know about the people, whether you want to know about the institutions. Hopefully it's all in there, and hopefully in a digestible way too.
Yeah, and I will leave a link to the History Hit Guide to Medieval England by Matt Lewis in the podcast description. But all that is left to say, Matt, is thank you very much for giving up your time to come talk to me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Daz. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to talk to you.
And all that is left to say is cheers.
Cheers.